Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin. More specifically, we're going to be discussing Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, the videos that we do on Bitcoin dominance do tend to be longer, so apologies for that. I have a feeling this won't be long as well. I have tried to keep some of the more recent videos much shorter, but it is nice sometimes to just go slow, go through the various parts of the market, talk about various aspects, talk about potential invalidation levels and counterpoints, and just try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So this video, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. We're going to be going through a lot of different things, and hopefully you find it useful. So the first thing I want to say is, last year was a really interesting year because last year was a year where going into the year, there were a lot of people that scoffed at the idea of dominance going back up to even 51%, right? I think a lot of people were really convinced that it was going to break down. And the general argument was that, well, the asset class is much bigger than Bitcoin now, therefore the dominance can't go back up to where it was previously. Now, I will admit that I don't think Bitcoin dominance is going back to 73%. I don't. I think that's a common misconception. What I think is theoretically possible is 60%. Now, there are no guarantees about that prediction. I do have to admit that, and to some degree, I'm happy that it's gone as far as it has, at around 55%, especially considering when it was back at 38%, even 55% seemed like a far-fetched dream. But in this video, we're going to explore, can it go higher than that 55% threshold? I do see a lot of people out there in the Cryptoverse that put out some compelling reasons why 55% could be the top. And so I do want to at least look at the other side of the story and see, is there any evidence at all to suggest that it actually could go higher than that level? One thing you might first notice, and I just want to get this part out of the way, is these circles over here, because I want to delete these circles. I just want to sort of explain why I have them on there. There's this pattern that I was looking at with regards to Bitcoin dominance. So you can look at this pattern here. Purple, green, green, two blues, right? You just keep putting in lower lows. You break that level, you go back down, sort of a double bottom breakout. Now look at the same chart, look at the same pattern on the US dollar currency index chart, the US dollar index. You see the similarities, right? You got your purple circle up here, your peak. Then you drop, you put in a low, and then you put in a high. Same thing. Then you put in a lower low, then you put in a lower high. Same thing with DXY, right? A lower low and then a lower high. And then dominance did another lower low. And then it took out these prior highs and it put in a higher high, right? So a lower low and then a higher high. And the dollar actually did the same thing, right? A lower low and then a higher high. And then after that higher high, it came back down and put in a higher low, which is the same thing that the dollar just did, right? It put in a higher low. And then after doing that, what dominance did was it went back up to the bull market support band, got rejected, put in a double bottom, and then was off to the races. Now look at where the dollar is right now. Same pattern so far up until now, and potentially where it is right at that bull market support band. Now, I don't know if it's going to continue to repeat this pattern or not, but if the dollar were to continue to repeat the pattern, then it means at some point in this window, turning back around, coming back down to this pink circle, confirming this as the bottom, and then moving higher. Okay? Now, you might say, Ben, this is great and all, but this video is on Bitcoin dominance, so what the hell are you doing talking about the US dollar currency index? Well, I think they are related in some regard. Take a look at what happened with the dollar back over here in July of 2023. Do you see how it went up for how many weeks in a row? Starting here, it went up. You can see 10. So the spread here was 10, meaning there was 11 green weeks in a row, right? Just count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 green weeks in a row starting in late July. Now look at Bitcoin dominance. What happened with Bitcoin dominance? Starting in August, so about a month later, you can see it had 9 or 10 green weeks in a row. So the dubious argument, right, is that if the US dollar currency index goes up aggressively, then so too could the dominance of Bitcoin, right? The dollar going up, sort of implies a risk-off type of environment, but not always. There are periods where the dollar has gone up and Bitcoin went up with it. If you don't believe me, just go look at 2016. 2016 was an example where the dollar went up here, and if you were to overlay Bitcoin USD onto the chart, you can see that Bitcoin was also going up even when the dollar was going up, right? So in general, though, we know that if the dollar is going up aggressively, then markets prefer blue chips over riskier stuff, right? And so the dominance could go up. So we get into a situation where if the dollar is in some type of bottoming process, and again, remember, this could continue to go on for some time. It could get rejected here. It might not. I mean, maybe it deviates. But if it does get rejected, comes back down and puts in a double bottom, and then starts to go back up, that could be sort of a signal that dominance is about to take off once again. Again, regardless of the direction of Bitcoin USD. I've said that for probably a year and a half now, right? That dominance will go up regardless of the direction of Bitcoin USD. Now, again, mostly Bitcoin has gone up, right? But again, that's part of the thesis, right? It doesn't matter what way Bitcoin goes. The dominance should go up either way. Now, that's sort of one side of it, to think about how the dollar relates to it. And by the way, if you don't like the way this looks, I mean, one way to look at this is some type of massive accumulation zone, right? But another way to visualize this is maybe take the inverse of the dollar, right? If you take the inverse of the dollar, you can see that I must have talked about this in a prior video, but sort of a distribution, right? Sort of these distribution phases up here. And again, it could come all the way back down here. Now, I do, if you look at the last chart we did, could bounce first, right? Maybe it bounces and then goes down. Now, what would happen if the dollar bounced, right? What would happen? What would happen if the dollar fell back in, I should say? Like if the dollar did something like this, where it followed what Bitcoin dominance did, where it gets rejected, goes back down, and then goes up, right? What if it did something like that, like this, right? Now, if that were to happen, then that could lead to another risk on time in crypto, right? If the dollar is going down. In the same way, if you think about it, if the dollar is going up, it would make sense that you think about sort of a risk off time. You think about this move over here by the dollar and how that was very much a risk off time. If the dollar were to come back down, confirm this double bottom, and then break out, that could be a risk off time. But in the meantime, what happens during the phase where it's coming back down? Well, one of the things that we've mentioned with Bitcoin is that, actually, let's look at it on a lower time frame first. So on a lower time frame, you can see what's happened so far is that Bitcoin has fallen back in to the bottom part of the range here, right? So it's been at this range since December 4th, and it's checked in with it now about 3 or 4 times. And so if this holds, right, if this holds and Bitcoin moves back up, what have we learned over the last year and a half, right? That we said going in, if Bitcoin moves up aggressively, guess what? The dominance of Bitcoin goes up. So if Bitcoin holds here and starts to go back up, then the dominance should go up with it. If on the other hand, we confirm a weekly close below the 8-week moving average, which is currently at, just over 42K, and if we do fall back into the bull market support band, it will be very important to see what the reaction is there, right? What is the reaction if we even go back down there? Again, I can't promise anything. I don't know if we're going to make it back down there or not in the short term. I can look back at history and say that every January or February of all prior halving years, Bitcoin checked in with the bull market support band. That doesn't mean that it has to this time. This is one of those things where we can point out the patterns all we want. Bitcoin's going to do whatever Bitcoin wants to do. Here's an example where it tested the bull market support band in Q1 of the halving year. It ultimately fell below it though. Here's another example right here where it tested the bull market support band in Q1 of the halving year. And then again, Q1 of the halving year, Bitcoin testing that bull market support band. And so I look at this and say, well, if Bitcoin does not hold the 8-week SMA and falls back into this level, I would still argue that the dominance could still go up following that event, right? Because if Bitcoin bounces off of it, then I imagine dominance would go higher. Or if in the process of falling, maybe altcoins just go down more, right? There is always a chance that happens as well. Now, there's one thing that continues to be a dilemma in my mind with regards to to the idea that some people have put forth that dominance won't go any higher. And again, I'm not saying they don't have valid arguments. I think a lot of them actually do have valid arguments, and I'm not trying to discredit what they're saying. I'm just trying to provide the other side of the argument, right? It's a market. Everyone gets things wrong all the time. And so for every person that thinks, something's going to play out this way, there's probably someone else out there that might think the opposite. But what I would say about dominance and why I'm skeptical of this being the end of it, and I will provide some counterpoints, is historically the Ether Bitcoin valuation breaking down. After it breaks down, that's normally where dominance aggressively makes a turn, after Ether Bitcoin breaks down. If you don't know what I mean, let's go take a look at the Ether Bitcoin valuation. Now look at this pattern here. You see this pattern? It's a pretty clear pattern, and you get a top, you set your low, and then you put a lower high, and then you keep testing that low until you ultimately break through it, right? So you keep testing it, you eventually break through it, and then once it breaks through, then Ether Bitcoin has found its bottom, within a couple of months or so, right? A couple months later, if you were to take a date range here from where it broke down to where Ether Bitcoin finally found its low, it was about 2 months. And if you go over here and look at it, it was about 2 months after it broke down. About 7 or 8 weeks or so. Now, when I look at this chart, I say, all right, you get a peak and then a second peak, and then you keep testing the low. And yes, occasionally we bounce off of that low, but history shows that eventually it breaks down. You can see that it broke down in late 2016. You can also see that it broke down in mid-2019. And by the way, it took a long time to break down. It took 82, 83 weeks. It's been about that long now, about 83 weeks or so. So we've already exceeded the amount of time it took compared to last cycle. But the point that I would like to make is that in all of these prior cases, the Ether Bitcoin pair, it put up a fight for a really long time. It didn't go down without a fight, right? Like the Ether Bitcoin bulls, they fought and they fought and they fought, and then eventually they gave up. Eventually, right? Eventually, the bulls on the Ether Bitcoin pair gave up, and Ether Bitcoin broke down. And I've been very clear about my views on Ether Bitcoin. My view is that eventually it breaks to the 0.03 to 0.04 range. I don't know exactly. That's just my guess. I could be wrong, right? I could be wrong. And, anytime I talk about the Ether Bitcoin pair on Twitter or X, I get ridiculed, right? But it's the same people that were ridiculing me when I was talking about how it was in a distribution phase back at the merge, you know? And so every time it gets any type of a rally off the lows, it's sort of like a gotcha moment. But is it really? Is it really a gotcha moment? Or is it just the same pattern that has been playing out in the past where it goes to these lows, it bounces, but then it still hasn't broken down? And so that's one of the reasons why I struggle to look at dominance definitively and say, is that the high? Because I look at Ether Bitcoin and I think, well, what if it still needs to break down? And if Ether Bitcoin were to break down and, to go from the current levels down here, that would be another 32% drop. And if Ether Bitcoin drops another 30%, well, then that's going to send the dominance of Bitcoin through the roof, right? Because it would likely take a lot of altcoins with it. So I struggle with that in terms of identifying, in terms of being as confident as others on identifying the high on dominance, simply because I look at the chart and I say, well, Ether hasn't broken down yet against Bitcoin. So is it possible that this time is different and we have some type of soft landing where it doesn't break down? I guess that's possible, but I would also be, I'd be remiss to simply say that it can't break down when it's still following the pattern from prior cycles. And if you think about when Ether broke down last cycle against Bitcoin, it broke down in July. Now, July is interesting because July is when we got our first rate cut, in fact, July of 2019. If you draw a line down the page, again, in July of 2019, that is when Ether Bitcoin broke down. It broke down just a couple of weeks before. But it was in that month that Ether Bitcoin broke down. And we can't know when rate cuts are going to come this cycle. We also don't know if it's going to play out the same way that it did last cycle. But until we've seen what happens, how can we know? What if it does play out the same way? What if Ether Bitcoin doesn't break down until the first rate cut arrives? The problem with that is we don't know when the first rate cut's going to arrive. It could be March, it could be May. In fact, right now, the market thinks it's not even going to be until May of 2024. The very beginning of May, right? May 1st. So I think, there's this idea of, well, if we get cuts in March, then maybe it breaks down in March. If we get cuts in May, then maybe it breaks down in May. If you look at the prior pattern over here with Ether Bitcoin, what you'll notice, at least in the last cycle, is that there was a low and then a lower low. Kind of the same thing right here, right? A low and then a lower low. And then it got a bounce, and then it did not retest it again for about 22 weeks. 22 weeks. If you were to go out 22 weeks from this bounce right here, it would put you, in fact, in June, right? In June. So that's, summertime. Ethereum, in terms of seasonality, like if you think about like when is Ether the weakest, it tends to be around May, June, July, right? The summer months are often not that kind to Ethereum. Now, during the merge, that was sort of a different story. But it still bled into June or July before then bouncing back up on its Bitcoin pair. So if you think about like when has Ether Bitcoin found this weakness, when has it historically found some weakness, oftentimes it is around May or June. You could also look at this bounce right here and see how long it took to get back down to the lows, and it only took about 8 weeks. Right? And if you took out 8 weeks from this level, it would put it out in March. So I think you could make the case that we could be seeing Ether retest the Bitcoin low of 0.049, I don't know, between 2 to 4 months from now, right? Maybe sooner, but, could be March, April, May, but sometime in the first half of the year, I think would be kind of an expectation that Ether Bitcoin could come back down and retest this low. And if you think about it, if we get a rate cut in March, then perhaps it's like this type of a move right here. And you can even see that weekly candle right here, if you look at the percentage right there, that weekly candle was 17.85%. The weekly candle we got last week was about 17%. So again, it's hard to know if it's going to just immediately fall back down or be like, what happened over here where it took a lot longer. Probably could play out completely different too. But I just want to be like honest. Like, I mean, I'm not here to, to say things that I don't think. A lot of people out there are, give different opinions on it, but this is what I'm looking at, right? What if Ether Bitcoin does still eventually break down, right? What if it still does eventually break down? And what if it doesn't occur until May or June, potentially at the latest? Which, again, would correspond to rate cuts. And if it were to break down, where do you think Bitcoin dominance goes? Yes, I get it. Every time I put out this video, I get a dozen people saying, well, what about this person? They're saying it's already, they're saying it's going to crash. This person's saying Bitcoin dominance is going to crash. They were saying the same thing a year ago too, and 2 years ago. And of course, they're going to keep saying the same thing. Yeah, they'll be right eventually, and maybe they're right now. But it's important to recognize that dominance can go up longer than a lot of people think it can. And it can also go higher than people think it can. If you're honest with yourself, there's a lot of people that scoffed at the idea that it would ever even go above 49%. Remember these arguments that we had last year where so many people said that, we were going to have alt season right here and that Bitcoin dominance was going to get rejected and go back down? Well, that didn't happen. It broke out. And it's true. We have fallen below the bull market support band. So why don't we pivot to that now and see what's going on there? Throughout all of 2023, Bitcoin dominance did not have a single weekly close below the bull market support band, right? You can see that it stayed above it every single time it tested it. There was 1 wick below it, but every single time it would test it, it would bounce, right? Here's another wick. We finally got a weekly close below the bull market support band in January of 2024. So this month. So then does that mean the trend is over, right? And I think it's a fair question, right? So I don't think it's not like it's obvious that it has to go up anymore, right? It's not. This prior trend of holding the 20-week SMA and or 21-week EMA, it has been broken, right? It has been. So we could go back to last cycle and see, did that happen at all? And there are some examples. I mean, there's this example right here where you can see that Bitcoin dominance was above the 20-week SMA for a long time. It finally broke down. And when it broke down, it actually broke down in like late 2018, early 2019, right? It broke below. So right around the turn of the year, it broke down. And then it stayed below that until April. What's fascinating about April, is that that's when the Bitcoin halving is. And it's also potentially around the time of rate cuts, plus or minus a month or so, right? Like maybe we get a rate cut in March, maybe we get one in May. But what happens if dominance starts to go back up again sometime around the halving? And I don't mean like, back up to 52%, right? If it goes back to 52%, no one's going to care. I mean, it could easily bounce around these levels for a long time, and it hasn't. If it hasn't taken out this high over here, it didn't really matter, right? So until it actually breaks out, it doesn't really matter if it gets any types of bounces. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it got below the bull market support band right here, faded. I mean, it went back up, right? But then it faded still until April, till the very beginning of April, and then it broke up. The reason I think that is an interesting observation is because this breaking up occurs potentially, if it were to happen in April again, about 1 month before the first rate cut, if the first rate cut occurs in May. Maybe it occurs in March, and then this timeline is accelerated. But remember what we said about Ether Bitcoin? how it could break down in sometime in the first half of the year. You know, maybe February, but likely. I mean, when you get a move this aggressive, you know, it would likely take, you know, many weeks for it to fade back down. So, you know, earliest could be March, all the way out through the first half of the year. It's just, I mean, and again, like you might say, well, you want something more specific. Guys, the hard part about all this is that the market really doesn't know when the first rate cut is coming, because the market doesn't know how much longer the economy can hold on. You know, it's always possible that the first rate cut doesn't occur until even later in the year, right? But when you look at dominance here, it made another move starting in April. Now look at this. Let's overlay interest rates on here. I'm going to change the color. Do you see where dominance finally topped? Where did it top? After rate cuts began, right? It was after rate cuts began, and this move here started, right? This move started before rate cuts began, right? It started in April. It started before the first rate cut arrived. And so what if something similar plays out? You know, maybe it doesn't even take until April for it to start to make its move. Maybe it starts to make a move in March or even February. So that, I think, is something to, you know, to keep in mind. Now, remember, there's all sorts of things we can look at with Bitcoin USD, right? Like there's the bull market support band, there's the 8-week SMA. We haven't tested those yet, and I frankly, I mean, I think there's a case to be made that we could test them in the first couple of months of this year, like we normally do. But if we don't test them and Bitcoin just breaks out again, where do you think dominance is going to go? Remember, historically, when Ether Bitcoin broke down in prior moves, right, when it broke down over here, it was on a Bitcoin rally, right? It was on a Bitcoin rally. When Ether Bitcoin broke down over here in late 2016, it was on a Bitcoin rally. And then Bitcoin topped out last cycle 1 month before rate cuts began, right? So last cycle, when Bitcoin had this impressive move, you know, all the way up to 14K or so, you can see that sort of preceded the first rate cut. Now, I'll be honest, I mean, this wick looks kind of scary, and it could be similar to that wick. But even if this is the high for a while, it doesn't mean you can't come back up and test it. I mean, you can see even in last cycle, we did go back up and test it. And if we take out that high, right? If we take out that high, then I have to imagine that dominance would go up. I have to imagine that dominance would go up in that type of scenario. So let's suppose, first of all, let's suppose Bitcoin breaks down to either to the bull market support band or the 100-week SMA. If it were to do that and then bounce back up aggressively, then that could be where Ether Bitcoin finally breaks down. If it doesn't go back down to those levels and then just goes back up, then it could break down a lot sooner. And then maybe you accelerate the timeline. Instead of being like May or June where it breaks down, perhaps it breaks down earlier, like March or something. So it's an interesting idea that I know a lot of people are sort of celebrating this bounce by Ether. But we said that it could bounce, right? I mean, like we said that, look, guys, it could bounce. And if it does, it still has a lot to prove. Because if you think about it, it still hasn't managed to take out a lot of these major milestones. Like look at this, look at it like this. This is the 50-week SMA, right? I mean, last cycle it bounced up near it and then still faded back to the downside, right? It still faded back down. So I find it challenging to, with confidence, say that the highs are in for dominance when I still think there is a reasonable chance that the Ether Bitcoin valuation could break down. That's my view, right? I think there's a case to be made that Ether Bitcoin could break down. Now, one thing that I will remind people of somewhat regrettably, to be completely honest, somewhat regrettably that I'll even say this, because it only ever leads to people mocking me. But I will say it just because it is, in my opinion, it's important, no matter what the haters want to say. But if we look at what happened to Ether USD, if you look at what happened to Ether USD after Ether Bitcoin broke down, right? So let me change this. So look at these prior moves. Do you see here where Ether Bitcoin finally broke down in October of 2016? What happened after it broke down? Ether USD collapsed. What happened when Ether Bitcoin broke down here in 2019? Ether USD collapsed. And what's interesting is from this high here to the low, Ether dropped about 70% after, around the time that Ether Bitcoin broke down. It was about a 70% drop. And then if you look at the last cycle, you can see here Ether Bitcoin broke down. How far did Ether USD fall? It was about a 70% drop. I mean, even if you exclude the pandemic and you just take it right there, it's about a 70% drop. Now, I don't know where the high is for Ethereum this year. I have no idea. But what's interesting is this drop right here. Let's ignore this sort of when it started and just take it from, say, like the wick right here. Maybe not even the wick. Like, take it from just that weekly open. That's about a 70% drop. Now, do you know what all three of these 70% drops by Ether USD have in common? It's that they all terminated at the lower part of the logarithmic regression band. Right? 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't know where Ether USD tops. It's possible that it already has. If Bitcoin goes up again and puts in a new high, or even if Bitcoin were to go back up to, the prior high, it's possible that Ether could go put in a new high. But what would it take to go back down to the regression band down here? Well, this was a 70% drop. This was a 70% drop. This was a 70% drop. Do you think before any of those 70% drops, people were screaming, hey, it's about to drop 70%? Probably not. But we don't really have a lot of data for this first one because the Ether Bitcoin pair just sort of that was where it was created. But I mean, kind of to imagine, right, that imagine that Ether Bitcoin just broke down right here. Ether USD dropped 70%. Ether Bitcoin dropped here. From this wick, at least, Ether USD dropped 70%. Ether Bitcoin broke down here. Ether USD dropped 70%. So then I guess the question is, well, will it do the same thing again? I don't know. But I will say, and this is where I get in trouble, because like if Bitcoin were to rally for the next, let's say Bitcoin just kind of does nothing for the next like 4 weeks, just kind of stays in the range that it's been in for a while. And let's suppose that sometime around the halving, we get another move by Bitcoin. It would likely drag ETH with it, okay? But imagine that, where I don't know how high you'd have to go for a 70% drop to be at the bottom of the regression band, right? So, and it depends on when as well, right? I mean, let's just say in May, then the bottom of the regression band will be, probably around 700, 800. This would put Ether USD, that 70% top, would be around 2,700, 2,800, maybe plus or minus a couple $100, right? So I just think it's interesting because that could correspond to Ether Bitcoin breaking down, right? It could correspond to Ether Bitcoin breaking down. And what's more interesting, if you look at Ether USD, or if you look at it here, it's actually still forming that same pattern, right? Where it's putting in these highs and then putting in these higher lows, or higher highs and higher lows. It then breaks out, but then eventually it breaks back down. You can see a very similar pattern over here, right? Like it's putting in these slightly higher highs, higher lows. It's starting to break out here. You could already argue that it has broken out. Look how long it took over here before it broke down, right? It took about 3 months or so, right? So 3 months from now puts it in April, right? Why is April important? That's right around the time that rate cuts might arrive. It could occur in March, it could occur in May, but let's suppose that rate cuts arrive, and then let's suppose that whatever Ethereum's valuation is at, on its US dollar pair, what if it starts to drop then as Bitcoin finally breaks it off support? So that's the important thing, is that, remember, Bitcoin rallies break alt Bitcoin pairs down, right? So if Bitcoin were to get another rally at some point in the next 2 to 3 months, then there's a good chance it could bring Ether Bitcoin back down to these prior lows. Now, I get that everyone's talking about the Ether ETF, and I'm not trying to discount that. I don't know exactly where that's going to end up. But if you think about it, even if the Ether ETF does get approved sometime in the next few months, look at what happened with Bitcoin's ETF once it got approved. I mean, it dropped. Bitcoin immediately dropped almost 20%, right? So yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that yes, people are going to continue to chase the narrative of the Ether ETF. And so for several more months, that could be the narrative that is sort of entrenched in our minds of the Ether ETF. But my point is that once that narrative has come and gone, right? Once it has come and gone, does Ether Bitcoin finally just break down? Once there's no longer another narrative to cling to, right? You already got the merge, you got all these ETFs, right? The Bitcoin halvings behind us. Then does Ether Bitcoin finally break down? And remember, historically, when it breaks down, it's on a Bitcoin rally, right? So it could be a rally. It could be a rally that Bitcoin gets after it bounces off the 100-week SMA. It could be a rally that gets off the bull market support band, or it could be a rally to a new higher high, right? It could be a rally to a new higher high where it takes out the prior high. And we've talked about, there's some evidence to suggest this could be a significant local top for a little while, especially given all the hype that came with it, and there being sort of these spot ETFs. And so I think that's a relevant thing to think about. Like, if that is the top, then a future rally by Bitcoin could put in a lower high, but it could still break Ether Bitcoin down. And if Bitcoin puts in a higher high, then I imagine Ether Bitcoin could still break down. So when I look at all that, I think, well, kind of seems like dominance could still go up. Now, if you were to look at dominance really closely here, let's look at it like this. You can see that this level right here, right, this level right here is actually the very similar level that this wick came back down to in 2018, right? So, my interpretation is that Bitcoin the dominance is hardening up, right? Yes, there's been a lot of selling pressure through GBTC. We know that, but despite all that selling pressure, dominance is still staying above the prior breakout zone, right, of 49%. So if you were to ask me, like, what is an invalidation, right? Like, where would I just say, all right, throw in the towel on it? Look, if it breaks back down below 49, like if it breaks back down below here, right, this area that it took forever to break out above, if we get back down here, then yes, it would be time to probably throw in the towel, okay? But as long as we're up here, I can't really come up with a compelling reason why I have to throw in the towel now on it. Because again, after it broke out of this range, it still took it from this breakout here until the next uptrend, until the next move really started. It took 34 weeks, right? So from here to where we currently are, we're currently at 32 weeks. So what if we're just in some type of consolidation, right? That is not that dissimilar from what we saw over here, where if you look, you can see that Bitcoin dominance was also in a downtrend channel, right? It was putting in lower highs and lower lows which is kind of similar to what's happening again right now in the short term, where it's in this downtrend channel. But it could still eventually break back up to the upside, just like it did right here, right? And so, what if it just continues to do that, where it just bounces around, and then by, March or April or something, or maybe even sooner, it just blasts off through here and dominance breaks up again, right as the same time that Ether Bitcoin finally breaks down. Right? Remember, Ether Bitcoin finally broke down after, or right around the time that rate cuts arrived. And again, we're probably looking at a rate cut in either March or May. Either March or May. So that's why I think, it's worthwhile to be a little bit flexible on this and say, all right, well, maybe it comes back down in March. Maybe it takes all the way out until late May or something to fade back down. But my guess is that it does eventually fade back down. And then once all the ETF narrative is behind us, then I suppose that it finally breaks down. If you were to look at, say, like total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, I get that, a lot of people are hopeful that it doesn't break down, but, from setting this wick here until breaking down, it took about, 41 weeks, 42 weeks or so. Here, we're currently only on week 30. If you were to take it out to 42 weeks, guess where that puts you? It puts you in April, which is the halving, right? And again, that's April is smack dab between the two most likely candidate months for a rate cut. Could be March, could be May. So I just want people to be aware that, yes, a lot of altcoins have held their own against Bitcoin since July. As you can see, that total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin has not broken durably below that low. But last cycle, we can see that it also took about 42 weeks before it broke down. And by the way, it did not break down until about a month before the first rate cut arrived. So perhaps it will do something similar, where it breaks down. You can see right here, it broke down right as that first rate cut arrived. If the first rate cut occurs in March, then maybe it breaks down in March. If the first rate cut arrives in May, then maybe it breaks down in May. I think one of the issues is that it's such an exhausting process, right? To look at this stuff. Because I think like a lot of people can like look at it and say, yeah, like it makes sense, but it's kind of a long time to just simply wait, right? And so that's why I've said before, guys, have a plan, right? Like do what you want to do. I mean, if there's stuff you want in your portfolio, you can always just DCA into that stuff and just say, all right, I acknowledge that perhaps Bitcoin will outperform it. And I acknowledge that maybe it'll play out like this. But if there's something you really want, you can say, all right, I know this is probably going to happen. Or if it repeats last cycle, then it could happen. But I'm just going to DCA it anyways. Okay, you can always come up with that and just tune me out. I think that's a valid strategy, to be completely honest, right? I'm not asking you to sit here every single week and watch to see if alts are going to break down against Bitcoin or not. But I feel like I have a responsibility to continue to follow up on this, since it's been a thesis that we've talked about for a long time. Will they eventually break down against Bitcoin or not? And, there's a lot of people that are saying, well, the narrative is shifting now. It's shifting away from Bitcoin and towards altcoins and towards Ethereum because of the Ether ETF. And while that may be true, I'm not trying to say that there's no narrative shift at all. There clearly has been, because Ether Bitcoin's now at 0.06 and it was at 0.05. There's also the halving for Bitcoin in April. So, what if the narrative just shifts back to that? Like if you think about, like, again, if you look at like the Ether Bitcoin pair, right? If you look at the Ether Bitcoin pair and you think about last cycle, it's not like there were no narrative shifts in here, right? When it rallied, when the Ether Bitcoin pair rallied back up from the low, almost 70%. And then again, it rallied off that low 40%. Yes, there were narrative shifts, but it still eventually broke down. And so what if, it does the same thing? I mean, I'm not saying it can't go any higher, but what if eventually, we get closer to the halving, people start to think, well, yes, the Ether ETF may be coming, but also there's the Bitcoin halving that's coming. And so a lot of that capital that left Bitcoin to go to Ether might just come right back, right? It might just go right back to Bitcoin. And perhaps such a move would correspond to the dollar getting rejected off the bull market support band, only to then come back down and set in a double bottom and then go up, right? So imagine if it were to play out like Bitcoin dominance did, where it came down, right? If we remember we were talking about this earlier, where Bitcoin dominance, it had this same type of long-term accumulation pattern, right? A low, a lower low, a lower low. You finally take out some of these prior highs, and then you set a double bottom after getting rejected off the bull market support band. What if during this period right here, if like Bitcoin dominance got rejected for a couple of months, what if the dollar does the same thing? During that period, if we go back to risk on and Bitcoin goes back up and then Ether Bitcoin finally breaks down, then Bitcoin would likely be able to roll over, and then there's nowhere for Ether to hide because it finally broke down on its Bitcoin pair. What are some counterpoints to this stuff? Because this is all great, you know, but there's got to be valid arguments the other way, and I think there are. One of the things that we've mentioned is the dominance. If you were to look at year-to-date ROI of dominance, I think that's a good way to look at it. Dominance without stablecoins, more specifically. Here's 2024, and then here's 2020, and here's 2016. So you can see that there's a case to be made that maybe dominance doesn't do what I just said, and maybe it just kind of, you know, oscillates around for the entire year, where it goes lower, but then maybe it just goes right back up, you know, by the end of the year. So you could have a scenario like that, where it just sort of moves around like this and doesn't get that breakout that, you know, that I just mentioned. There are some counterpoints to that, because as we know, the year-to-date stuff does not always play out. Take a look at what happened in 2023 and look at 2019 and look at 2015. They're all pretty similar years, right? 2015, 2019, and 2023. In fact, 2023 played out really similar to 2015 in terms of where it actually ended the year. But if you look at 2022 compared to 2018, 2018 Bitcoin dominance went up a lot more than it did in 2022. So the argument that I'm trying to make is, what if this gap here, right, the fact that dominance stayed, and guys, this excludes stablecoins. A lot of times people say, well, the market's different now, we have stablecoins. This is excluding the stablecoin market, right? It's excluding the stablecoin market, and we've been showing this chart forever, excluding the stablecoin market. What if we have to still make that move because Ether Bitcoin still needs to break down? Because last cycle, it broke down in 2019, in the pre-halving year. But also last cycle, rate cuts occurred in the pre-halving year. What if this cycle, rate cuts occur in the halving year, and that's where Ether Bitcoin finally breaks down? So perhaps we're sort of switching out, you know, the 2024 trend with the 2022 trend or something, where normally the dominance would have gone up more in the bear market year, but it didn't. And so then therefore it goes up more in the halving year. It's just one way to think about it, right? I'm not saying it has to play out like that, but it is something to think about. There are some other valid counterpoints, I think. So like, if you were to look at like Bitcoin dominance plus, let's say, USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, look at this chart. Let's imagine, unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of data before here, because you know, just TradingView doesn't have the history for that, for the USDC stablecoin. Beyond that, you only can look to see, like, you know, since when the newest asset has been around, or since when TradingView has data for it. But if you look at it like this, right? If you look at it like this, where are we now? Right here. What's interesting about this level right here? Well, let's draw a line across the page and see the last time we were at this level after breaking above it in the last cycle. Okay, it was right here. Now draw a line from this wick here over here. Now look at this. this wick here sort of matches up with this one. And then these lows here on Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, it fell back into about 58%, which is exactly where it is now, right? Exactly where it is now. And then look what happened after it spent about a month at these levels. Starting in June of 2019, it absolutely blasted off to the high part of the range. It blasted off. Why did it go up so much? What happened in June of 2019? Well, that was again 1 month before rate cuts arrived. 1 month before rate cuts. Right? So it came down and then blasted off. And when it finally made that move, it broke all Bitcoin pairs down. But it kept going up. Why did it keep going up? It's because the dominance of stablecoins was going up because people were selling their crypto, right? They're selling their crypto. Look at USDT dominance on this chart. You can see that USDT dominance was going up during that time, right? It was going up, and that also, helped this whole chart go back to the upside. Now, you might say, well, let me pull it up on a different thing. Okay, so now let's look at just Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, because you might look at the prior chart and say, well, what happens if it's not an oscillator? The thing is like, last cycle, if you just look at dominance of Bitcoin plus USDT dominance, you could make the case, somewhat, I suppose. It only went a little bit lower over here than it did over here. What if what if we're just simply in this phase, right? What if we're just in this phase right here, where eventually it still breaks to the upside, right? Where it still breaks to the upside. It's possible. Another way to look at this, by the way, is to look at USDT dominance by itself. This is kind of a scary chart. So there's two ways to look at it. There's an optimistic way and a very pessimistic way. We'll start with the optimistic way. This is the optimistic way to look at it. Why is this the optimistic way? Well, if you look at USDT dominance, every time it hits this trend line, it's corresponded to major pullbacks in crypto. If you don't believe me, let's take a well, let's just go look. November of 2021. I don't have to tell you what was going on. You know what was going on in crypto in November of 2021, right? November of 2021, right here. That was just before a larger pullback began. Here, this was March, April, May of 2021, just before a major pullback occurred. Here, February 2020, just before the March 2020 crash. Right here, July of 2019, just before Bitcoin topped out. Or no, just after Bitcoin topped out, right? Now let's overlay Bitcoin USD onto the chart. You can see what I'm talking about, right? When it hits this trend line, it's not a good thing. So that would suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's still some more room in the tank for this to go, for USDT dominance to go down before it then goes back up. That's the optimistic way to look at it, right? And again, I'm not saying it could play out like that. We've made the case that if the dollar gets a pullback, and we know that Ether has not yet broken down against Bitcoin, perhaps there's reason to believe that Bitcoin could get another push into the halving and Tether dominance goes down again. The reason why it's a little iffy and not set in stone is because while this looks really, really clear, you could also put this on a log chart. I'm not really sure how much it makes sense because it is a percentage, but if you were to put it on a log chart, it tells a slightly different story. And that story is that we're already there, right? If you look at it on like a log chart and you connect the dots, you could say that we're already at this level, right? We're already at the levels that, when previously this trend line hit was not a good thing. Okay, so Probably makes more sense to look at it on the regular axis, to be completely honest, but just for the sake of completeness, I wanted to show it here. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is if you look at the fib retracement from this level here, and you compare it to last cycle, what you'll notice is that Bitcoin had, it did not have the larger pullback until after Bitcoin dominance had retraced all the way back up to the 0.5 fib, the 0.5, right? I need to switch this to a regular scale. So here you can see that Bitcoin USD was still chopping around up here, and it did not finally begin the trend back down until after dominance broke through the 0.5 fib. The 0.5 fib this cycle is about 56%. We haven't hit 56% yet. But what if we do? What if, at some point between now and the halving, the dollar pulls back, Bitcoin gets another move, dominance goes to 56%. I don't know if it'll be a lower high for Bitcoin USD or if it will be a higher high. What I do think needs to happen during whatever move comes, I think Ether Bitcoin is going to break down. Okay, so whether Bitcoin puts in a lower high or a higher high, I think Ether Bitcoin will probably break down. You might say, well, last time what made Ether Bitcoin break down? Was it a higher high or was it a lower high? Well, it depends on which time you look. There's two examples, and in both cases, we basically have something different that happened, right? If you look in 2019, Ether Bitcoin, you might be surprised to know this, but Ether Bitcoin over here broke down the week of July 8th. July 8th was this wick. That was right here. That was a lower high, right? It was a lower high. Because Bitcoin put in its high the week of June 24th. But then it put in a lower high the week of July 8th. But on the week of July 8th, Ether Bitcoin broke down. Even though Bitcoin was not putting in a new high, it still broke down. But if you go back to the cycle before that, if you go back over here and you look at Ether Bitcoin, right here, you can see that it broke down in late October 2016, early November. Well, late October, early November, Bitcoin was actually still at a lower high, in fact, but it ended up becoming a higher high, right? But in both cases, Ether Bitcoin broke down at lower highs. One case, Bitcoin went on to go to a higher high. The other case, Bitcoin just put in a lower high and went back down as rate cuts were ushered in. So that's another thing to think about, And again, as I've said before, right? Like, it's not that you can't make money on ETH, right? I mean, I know everyone and their mom is now chasing the ETH ETF narrative, okay? But my point is that Ether is staying elevated because of Bitcoin and not the other way around, right? It's not, Ethereum is not the one holding up the market. It has been Bitcoin that has been holding up the market for a long time. Now, sure, you can point to the last couple of weeks and say, well, this has been one hell of a move by Ether. So what? It still is down. It still has been in a macro downtrend against Bitcoin since the merge, which is when I said this was a secondary distribution phase, just like Bitcoin USD. And a lot of people did not want to listen to that when I said that was a secondary distribution phase. And since that time, Ether Bitcoin has fallen even to the current levels, 30%, right? I can't tell you how many videos I've made over the last couple of years talking about every single one of these lower highs. I mean, every single one. And every single time, it bounces, everyone loves to come out and say, well, look at that. But it still eventually just faded back down. You may say, well, eventually it's going to break back up and it won't fade back down. I agree with you. I really do. I do. I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, even though I do sometimes seem like I'm one on here. But I just think that it's going to break down before we can say that, right? I think we need to go down to this level here. So perhaps that's what happens, right? Where it just sort of slowly fades back down. Maybe it doesn't take that long, but where it just sort of slowly fades back down into here, and then sundown somewhere over here it bottoms, and then we just go on another type of move. I could see that happening. It's a way to think that it could eventually go. We could also understand some of Bitcoin dominance through altcoins again, right? Like you could look at like the ADA Bitcoin pair and see that it's kind of doing something very similar to the last cycle it did, right? Where it found a low. It found this low here, right? And then after finding that low, it then bounced back up to this high. And now it's starting to fade back down. Look at this high. When did this high occur? April of 2019, May, June, July, 3 months before the first rate cut. This occurred in December, January, February, March. Maybe we'll get a rate cut in March. So or maybe it'll take until May. I don't know. But I think the thing to look for is ADA Bitcoin doing the same thing it did last cycle, where everyone just joins in thinking the hype's going to last forever, and then it still just ends up being a lower high, and ADA Bitcoin fades back down and still eventually breaks down, right? That's what happened last cycle, right? Again, it put in these highs. After going down to 800 sats, it went all the way back up to, to almost 2,000 sats. Very similar move over here. It then faded back down and eventually broke. One thing that could be a warning sign for Ether Bitcoin could be if alts break down. Because if you look at alt USD or alt Bitcoin pairs, last cycle, they actually broke down. I think maybe like slightly before Ether Bitcoin broke down. So if you were to zoom in, they broke down the week of June 24th, right? Ether Bitcoin didn't break down until 2 weeks later. So it could be that if you see alt Bitcoin pairs breaking down, that could be a warning sign for Ether that it's going to break down too. Okay. And look at this. Look at this move here, right? It's a very similar move. You go to this low, right? You put in a low, you retest it, same thing over here. And then you bounce up to this high, same thing right here. And then perhaps it just slowly fades back down, and it potentially breaks right around the time of rate cuts, right? Which means, it could still stay elevated for a few more months, but I still think eventually it'll likely break down. Remember, over here, when it broke down, it was on a Bitcoin rally, right? It was on a Bitcoin rally. So those are my thoughts on Bitcoin dominance. And we've thrown in some counterpoints. I've said, look, if it goes below the breakout zone here, then I would concede, that it likely isn't going to 60%. But as long as we stay above the breakout zone, just like we stayed above it over here, as long as we stay above that, and you can even see it's almost an identical pattern. Look at this. Look, you break out right here, right there. And then after breaking out, you retest it. Let me see if I can show you. So look, you break out right here, and then you retest it. You break out right here, and then you retest it. But then you eventually put in this high, which is like this high right here. And then you put in a lower high, which maybe is this lower high right here. But ideally, it puts in a macro higher low, where somewhere over here, it finds a higher low, and rather than going back down to this level, it just blasts off. So, look, guys, I don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. I imagine that if dominance were to go back below 50% or below 51%, let's say it goes back down to 50.5, I know a lot of people are going to be wondering what's going on. But just know, as long as it's above the breakout point from from earlier, then it's potentially doing what it did in the last cycle. Right? I know there's a lot of people that think that Bitcoin dominance doesn't matter anymore because of the stablecoin market. But again, what were their views on dominance a year ago? Right? All I saw a year ago was alt season calls. Alt season is this. This is alt season where dominance is cratering by like, 20 or 30%, right? That's alt season. No one in the future is going to look at this move by dominance and say, oh, look at that alt season. No, this has been Bitcoin season. It's not been alt season. Alt season is where dominance is going down very, very quickly. And I'm not saying it can't slowly fade until we have a sufficient reason to bounce like we did over here in April of 2019. What I'm saying is that at some point, I think there's going to come a time within the next few months where it's going to get a massive bounce out of this range. And guess what will happen if that happens? Then people will call the top on it again. But again, I mean, like, it's possible that 55% is the high, but I hope that I've provided some compelling evidence for you to think about that might show why it could be premature to assume that that is the main outcome. There are reasons to think that Bitcoin dominance could break out again. Hopefully I provided that in this video. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.